Hello, and welcome everyone to the Arma 3 background, history, and setting stream. My name is Niles, aka Nillers, and Arma Senior Community Manager. Arma 3 is nearly 10 years old, and today we're looking back into the past to see how this project started and some of the behind the scenes knowledge on its construction and setting. I'm joined today by two very special guests, Ivanbhukta and Scott Alsworth, who will be answering some very interesting questions to us regarding the history and setting we all know and love. However, I'll let them introduce themselves. Gentlemen, can you tell us who you are and how you've been involved with Arma 3?
Hello, my name is Ivanbhukta and I was the creative lead in the very beginning of the project. Otherwise, I'm working as a creative director for current Arma Reforger and our future Arma 4. I've been in the company for almost 17 years after some years in the Flashpoint community. I have some background in environmental sciences. I love nature. I love military history, and many people can testify that it unfortunately shows. So, hello, everyone.
Thank you, Yvonne. And how about yourself, Scott?
All right, hello. So I'm Scott Alsworth. I am a freelance narrative designer and game writer, and I've been collaborating with Bohemia Interactive for nearly 10 years now. And I came to the Arma Free team shortly after release.
So obviously, Arma 3 was released in 2013, 10 years ago, and yet the game was set in 2035. How and why was this futuristic setting chosen? Can you explain that?
Of course, like there was this very difficult or obscure start of the whole Arma 3 project. If we look back into actually Arma 2 development, Brno Studio has a sort of remnants of former Altar Interactive, consisting mostly of the artists. We put together British Armed Forces DLC for Operation Arrowhead, and afterwards there were plans to make another game. And as this part of the company showed we can handle something, we started talking about a game which would sort of utilize some of the know-how or interests of people from Altar. By the way, they made the trilogy of UFO turn-based strategies. In one meeting with Marek and Slavek Pavlicek, Arma Futura was coined as a RTS set in near future, in which humankind, with some futuristic-ish weapons present in Arma Engine, of course, would battle alien invasion. Of course, eventually the project changed, team changed. It became apparent that it wouldn't work as an RTS series, and we gradually gravitated towards more of a classical Arma sandbox scheme.
Okay, so indeed, that was a choice that was made during the pre-production phase. It was a very early decision, so it wasn't one that I had a lot of. I didn't really contribute to. But what I will say is that I think I can sort of project here and say that one of the reasons that I'm sure the development team went in that direction with the futuristic setting was that it offered a lot of gameplay opportunities but also a lot of creative flexibility. We weren't really hamstrung by historical precedents or anything like that. We could just really let our imagination run riot.
So, with this futuristic setting of 2035, how did you select the assets, such as like the weapons and vehicles and structures that you would be putting in this futuristic environment?
Well, of course, we started with the knowledge of some most recent development. Americans started using MRAP vehicles, mine-resistant heavy trucks, which they needed in Iraq and Afghanistan campaigns. So we were naturally interested in how these beasts look like. We knew about some very peculiar designs, like for example Israeli Tavor assault rifles. It all looked like coming from the future. So instead of trying to invent something from scratch, we naturally started borrowing from reality and cherry picking those interesting bits. Of course, after we changed the plans and the original RTS scheme, which was supposed to use some very schematic lineup of items, we needed more, and then we started either inventing things or we even asked some specialists for consultations. Like one of those contraptions we've invented ourselves, of course, based on some existing things, is this Mi-48 Cayman, this beast of a helicopter used by the CSAT in Arma 3. It would never fly, which became apparent when we tried to use a flight model from Take-On helicopters on it. I said, what is this? It would barely stand. It wouldn't fly at all. But it's a combination of Mi-28 Havoc and Mi-24 Hind. And at the time, we were focusing more on Captain Miller as protagonist of more of a post-apocalyptic or apocalyptic role-playing game in open world Altis. And this beast was designed just to scare him, just to scare from above. Of course, as Arma 3 was still meant a sandbox, it came with a cockpit and full usability. But there were some really cool additions which are based on a real expertise. So, for example, a weapon designer from a small American company, CMMG, designed the MX rifle lineup. It was based on our idea that caseless ammunition is sort of way to go in the future, because you can carry more ammunition and less eject brass. So kinda made sense. Like, we're no specialists, it was maybe a bit naive. And of course, then there were drones, and there we it's funny how we went correct with drones being part of the battlefield. But how much we underestimated were the tech, or how far the technology could reach in a matter of few years. Like, our drones were huge. You have to have a big backpack in the game and to unpack it. But now you can basically like fold the drone and put it in your pocket, and it's really miniaturized. So it was quite an uncanny mix, and many approaches. But in the end, we tried to keep everything looking plausible, authentic.
So, speaking of the environment, Arma 3's main campaign was set on the islands of Stratus and Altus. These are locations that were roughly based on real places, but why were these locations selected specifically?
There were a couple of factors. Of course, we choose our we choose the real counterparts of our environments, usually based on some like personal tie or some personal interest. In this case, it was Marek Spaniel, who returned from a family holidays on some remote Aegean island, and say, hey, I'm at island which would be just perfect, like not much vegetation, fairly rugged, so it's not boring. There are no major rivers, so it sounded like something we could implement in real virtuality quite accurately without doing major compromises or omitting some parts of the landscape, like the river. And it was like 2009 or 10, I think. And it was like a few years later when we revisited the idea. I was like, yeah, it could be cool. Like, I wanted to come up with a setting which would be very different from what we've been doing so far. Like dating back to Operation Flashpoint, everything was inspired by the Czech Republic, Bohemia, Sahrani, desert island. Everybody loves desert island, but trying something Mediterranean, subtropic, arid, with a bit different atmosphere. It felt really, really attractive. And for me personally, I always loved Malden Island because it looked like a very gloomy version of your usual Mediterranean holiday resort, and it's like, yeah, like the this is potentially a very interesting world. Of course, it was downsized, it was changed, it was just completely reimagined. So yeah, there's many similarities, but also way too many differences to call it the same or just a copy. And yeah, in 2012, 2013, we had it done.
How did you decide the amount of detail and scale that went into these terrains? Altus, for example, is a whopping 260 kilometers squared with a variety of cities and landscapes. Can you talk about that a bit?
I would say that the environment team kind of self-regulated the density of objects because we had finite amount of time and tried to keep things well managed, as our art production capabilities were also limited. We had just a bunch of trees, bunch of brushes, only few types of houses. Then, as we wanted to have part of the island like destroyed by a mysterious anomaly, we are still referring to some intentions behind Captain Miller in an RPG game. So it was quite a strain on the team, and we really didn't want to overdo it. So in fact, compared to many other terrains we've had, it's big, it's spacious, it's the biggest terrain in Arma so far. But it vegetation wasn't dense, and villages were composed in the same manner. So and there were lots of tricks involved to make various parts look different. Of course, part of island is hilly, part of the island is let's say flat. Some parts of the satellite imagery were toned to brown, like in the southeast. So all in all, we were able to combine some of the few major things like vegetation species or architecture to form a very well, not very, but let's say different corners of the same world, and it still looked fairly consistent.
Arma terrains have always attempted to create believable environments with natural landscapes, logical road systems, livable cities, and more. But how much research and development goes into creating some of these realistic places in a fictional space?
A lot of research, I would say, and the amount of research and let's say effort and diligence we put into it has been growing steadily. Like we started with Chernors as a first true big terrain, which was created out of geographic data. So it was known territory in many aspects when we started with Arma 3s, Altis, and Stralis. Naturally, we had some good terrain model, and we obtained, actually purchased, and even ordered the satellite flyby over Stratis, so we would have satellite imagery, which would be devoid of any cloud canopy. And based on this, we were able to kind of judge how the terrain looks like. Then came interpretation of what should be there, and in the same time, at that time, Panoramio was still a big thing, and there were a lot of holiday photos. So even without visiting the terrain, we were able to put together a very plausible image of a Aegean island. The huge thing is not just research directly the geography we would like to copy. It's also about researching all the background information so that we understand and can change it into our fictional setting. Like by default, all our terrains represent fictional countries, fictional regions. Armaverse is geographically a bit mingled Earth. So, for example, be it Altis or Tanoa, we had to understand the local culture a bit and the history to be able to come up with something plausible which would be compatible with what people would see and meet in the game, and allow us to support the narrative. For us, it's really important to know like what's the flag of a particular country and how it emerged. What's the history which kind of influences land use, for example.
There's a lot of unique structures and architectural designs on these islands, and I just had to ask, what influences were there from reality, and how did you decide and pick which certain design choices would go on through to the game, and how did that process kind of look?
We mostly focus on picking up the most common things first, because they are the backbone. Basically, you need the most common tree, you need the most common type of building in several variants, because you need to fill the landscape, and the landscape can work even like without anything super special or specific landmarks. Those landmarks obviously are important. They are important for navigation, for telling a bit of the country's history, or highlighting some places. But they only come later. They are equally important, but if you compare the effort we spent on just the boring regular stuff, it's much bigger. Like it's the traffic signage, or verge pole, or how road is painted or fixed, or how does the normal building look like, which really constitutes the visual identity of a terrain. With Arma 3 setting in the future, we also had to invent a couple of structures which don't entirely belong to our times, mostly like military. So those domes arranged in the hexagon on Altis, or those cargo packable little fortresses and watchtowers, they originate back to the first version of our Altis story. And they became some sort of parts of the Arma 3, Arma 3's visual identity, as something like totally strange and wrong in the landscape, which was the intention. And so along with researching stuff which would belong there, abstracting some of the local important things to fill the interesting spots. We also came up with some futuristic military installations which would also communicate, hey, it's 2035 and the world is at war.
There are certainly a lot of different major parties and groups and factions in Arma 3. Some examples of this is like NATO and CSAT. Can you tell us a little bit about the background of these different factions and how they were selected as part of the overall story in the game?
It was actually a lot of fun to invent them all. Like maybe it should be noted that when we devise military factions, of course, we are inspired by some geopolitics to breathe in some identity. I believe every faction should have their goal, their meaning, their reason for existence. Then they have their own culture, their traditions, their victories, and in Arma you can easily play for any faction. So while we state, okay, these are the bad guys in some particular story campaign or a scenario, it's kind of, you need to have adversary, although for the sandbox they should be balanced. And I always wanted to deliver things which could be accepted by the players. Hey, I can play for this guy. I can play for this faction. They're cool in a way. So NATO was heavily inspired partly by the stuff we've seen in the news, partly by the Israeli military, which has a lot of interesting futuristic concepts. I've mentioned Tavor. We also had Merkava tank and APCs and IFVs derived from its chassis. CSAT, on the other hand, like a massive global army, basically ready to dominate the world. We designed it to be like intimidating. It was big fun to watch one of our senior artists, Vespa, designing the helmet and things around it. Like those suits and oversuits. The suit was kind of inspired by some all climate suit or desert suit from Dune novels. Then okay, we need some Eastern faction. So he took the most obscure motor helmet or motorbike helmet he found and tried to mold it into a combat helmet. So there were those like add-ons with some visors for augmented reality, and there were those like filters. So but sadly we never got to make like a full face cover variant of this. Well, Apex and Contact, very different territories. With Apex, like I was more like advising the environment team rather than doing anything else, although I was also around, for example, CSET Pacific Riskin. Well, the camouflage is heavily inspired by a very cool looking Finnish M05 camouflage. But it was remixed, and for Tanoa I kind of assisted by putting together a color scheme which was fitting the environment. Otherwise, all the credit goes to the others. So as you can see, like every faction has its identity, visual identity, so that it's recognizable, history, and some special flair, so that when you play with it, you can enjoy something unique, something nice.
Each of these factions has a very notable identity in the game. Different unique camouflages, weapons, vehicles, characters, and even languages. How did the process of creating these factions in the Armaverse occur?
Creating a faction is really a lot of work, and there is a lot of hidden complexities there too. You mentioned language. Obviously, every time we create a new faction, we have to do a lot of audio work to produce the new radio protocols and the voice procedure, and there's then complications in writing dialogue for campaign narratives, where there needs to be sort of like a rogue translation pipeline for the voice actors so they'll have a script to read from. But actually, something that doesn't get mentioned a lot in creating a faction is the uniqueness of that faction. And early on in Arma 3 development, it was actually quite okay. But the more factions we introduced, there was this pressing need to make them individual, to make them stand apart. And it's not just for the overall aesthetic, it's also for gameplay. If you imagine that you're on the battlefield and you see a distant target, you need to be able to positively identify that target. So we need to make decisions on the as I say, the silhouette of the character, the profile of the individual assets. So if you have a tank, ideally you don't want tanks looking the same for every faction. But yeah, the idea is to try to give each faction a very unique identity, and that can be a challenge.
It's very different for each phase of the project, for each DLC. Sometimes it's very organized. So, for example, Amsterdam guys, when they created IDEP faction, because we couldn't use the Red Cross, even though we have a very good relationship with this organization. IDEP was result of a very let's say organized, well-concerted effort, while, for example, CSET, as I kind of invented it, arose from many inspirations from the geopolitical situation we wanted to kind of depict, or with which we wanted to scare the player, and it was a bunch of very like a personal inspirations, opinions, thoughts, ideas, coupled with some concepting on part of the senior artists surrounding me. After you write down all the requirements, after you kind of know, yes, this is what we need, this is how we approach it, this is what we can do, this is what Arma Sandbox needs, because there's this like colloquial know-how we have on the design level, then it comes down to some aesthetic preferences.
Eastwind is Arma 3's main campaign and is done in a 3-part episodic format. How did the development of the story begin, and how did it change through the process?
Well, I was in the very beginning of the development of the story, which, as I've already mentioned, was supposed to be something completely different. However, the basic setup of CSET occupying the island and NATO having to seize it in cooperation with locals, it remained. It was repurposed for the factions we were able to pull out, and in the end, it was credibly worked on, tested, and published. I advised on the military situation, which was like a pretty similar to what we intended originally. So I made some colorful maps for the guys depicting those phases and what would be the objectives, what would make sense. But it was like a very high level point of view, and more like a help or assistance to the process, which was driven by someone else.
What would you say is the most significant challenge to building a story in a game like Arma 3?
Speaking in a narrative design capacity, I think I can maybe summarize it in three words: communication, consistency, and coherency. For me, these are the three unique challenges of telling a story within a development team. You have to make sure that everybody understands that story and that everyone is familiar with it. And it's a sort of a multidisciplinary challenge. The audio team need to understand where you're going with the story. The design team very obviously need to understand, but also the art team and everybody, even down to localization. When translators are working with the texts, they're going to have a lot of queries. They need to know that they're getting it right. Then you have coherency. Obviously, in storytelling, you need a coherent story, and it may sound obvious, but sometimes it happens. Sometimes you have these something gets lost in translation, or somebody maybe understands something a little bit differently, and this can happen especially in a big team. And the final one is consistency, which does correlate a lot with coherency, but consistency is really just making sure that everything connects together, and also that you're establishing a proper tone, that you're not going off on a tangent that somehow really conflicts with the intellectual property of the Arma franchise. So these are unique challenges, and of course there are lots of others, but off the top of my head, those would be the three that I would name.
Well, regardless of what story we have told, or what stories we have told with Arma 3, because there are a couple of memorable ones besides Eastwind. You have Apex campaign, you have the story of Contact. There are even some fairly small scenarios which are presented in a Tech Ops DLC. So there's actually plenty of little stories which all contribute to the image of 2035 to 7, I think, presented in Arma 3 as a sample of, well, this is not the future we would want, but this is the future wars on various parts of the earth. They have a lot in common, of course. We have the Arma sandbox, and we have certain ways of constructing the scenarios. They usually are, or they should be, set up so that they don't rely on players' actions. They don't wait for player. Player is one of the many actors on the battlefield, but he must not be exclusive. So it sounds like a very open sandbox where you have very little chances to actually control player and feed him the right bits of the experience in a particular time, which you need to do to tell the story. Basically, story is usually linear, and you need to tell it from the beginning to the end, and it has its own rules. However, in the same time, you know that player can go anywhere. So the biggest challenge is to not to limit player when he wants to play the game, and protect their freedom so that they can approach various tactical problems in their own way, and still be able to present story in some meaningful fashion, still make him part of things. So I believe that this is something which we've been not struggling, but it's our eternal challenge with Arma. Player's freedom versus control over player and telling the story.
There are a lot of political and cultural background story that goes into an Arma title, even for fictional factions. How did you develop their backgrounds to be as realistic possible in some of the projects that you've worked on?
Largely by analogy, we will take a lot of real-world precedents. We will look, in terms of factions, we will look at modern militaries, sometimes even historical conflicts, for inspiration. But also the realism flows from the environments that we create, from the worlds that we create. So some of that realism comes directly from the geostrategic contexts that we develop. So it's very much like a jigsaw piece that we will fit into a context that we have created, and in doing that, if we do it right, it will feel fairly seamless, and therefore quite realistic, right down to things like the order of battle for particular units. So we really try to connect it all together.
I believe we can say that we build the factions and their meaning and goals based on real life analogies. Like we've always wanted the game to be plausible. It starts with the plausible rules, which are applied in a environment with a plausible scale, but it also has to be the motivation of an army to go to war. So, if someone's inciting an armed conflict, if someone's taking part in it, they have their goals, they have their motivation. Can be protection of their homeland, can be greed, can be hatred. We are trying to stay away from, for example, religious conflicts and stuff, because frankly, we do not understand that too well. But there are plenty of your common usual reasons to start a war. Sometimes wars can be even started by mistake, which is a very interesting idea. So learning from literary history, learning from the real geopolitics, we draw the inspiration we need. But whatever we do, we always try to keep things plausible.
How much connection is there from previous Arma titles to Arma 3 regarding the story and setting?
Not much, not always. It's the same universe, the same, shall we say, Armaverse, as we often refer to it. But each installment in the Arma franchise is a self-contained story. There may be a little bit of overlap. For instance, in Arma 3, we had Colonel Armstrong. Is it a playful reference to Operation Flashpoint? Well, you could read it that way. Is it a distant relative? Possibly. There is this interplay, and of course, AAN News. We often come back to that as a framing device for many of our stories, but no strict overlap, no strict consistency between games. It's very much. If we see an opportunity to hark back to something we've done before, or a nice little reference, we'll take it. But yeah.
Arma 3 Apex was the first expansion to extend the setting and location of the game into a new terrain, Tanoa, and its focus on CTRG. Can you touch on when this idea was kind of originally developed and how it kind of came to be?
At some point, we wanted to work on a bigger expansion, providing terrain, providing new factions, and bring some more exciting content to Arma 3, basically liven up the whole thing for everyone. And for the terrain and for the setting, Pacific was one of the three geographical locations we considered, along with Northern Europe and Australia. I myself vouched for Australia a lot because sometimes its natural scenery is like a very alien. It's visually very different, reddish soil, and you have variety of rocky, semi-arid areas. You have deserts, you have mangroves, you have very strange-looking gum tree forests. So I kind of like the idea of expanding NATO by some sort of like a Australian Defence Forces flavored troops. I kind of like the visual. It dates back to cooperation with the VBS guys. But we let the environment team do the prototypes, and it was not that it kind of worked, the Pacific Island. It became apparent that the guys love it. So I was like, yeah, go for it. So we actually made a matrix and analyzed pros and cons. Then other people started constructing the story and the factions. Me and Jay were talking about potential motivations of particular actors in that place. But it eventually led to creation of Pacific Seasat, to some woodland variant of CTRG, and there were local factions which were some, like pressure groups, paramilitaries. Funny thing is that we always wanted to do a Pacific atoll, Pacific island. For example, in Game 2, Game 2 was supposed to contain Chernarus. We did it in Arma 2. Pakistan, or some Afghani-like terrain mountain, which we pulled out in Arrowhead, although the first prototypes were made during 2006 when Game 2 was still a thing. And the third one was supposed to be the Banda Atoll. The Arma 1 banana advertisement. I don't know if people still remember it. It was supposed to be the cover company for the bad guy who was ultimately to be fought in Game 2's final environment, tropical atoll. Of course, it's a very different environment, and it kind of nicely complements the lineup of terrain types we have. So we were gradually returning to that idea, and eventually it fructified in the Apex.
What techniques did you use to make characters memorable? How did you kind of develop this in the writing process?
Lovely question. I think one thing that I will certainly say that is a technique I'm particularly fond of is inverting stereotypes. I feel that this is quite important. We tried it in Contact with the character of Jack Stipe, who was meant to be this instructor figures, a little bit like Sergeant Adams in the Eastwind campaign. So we started thinking, okay, this needs to be a responsible figure. He needs to be teaching the player things. We need to learn from him. He needs to be like our mentor. In fact, that was actually a development term. He's the mentor. But I really wanted to go in this different direction and thought, well, wouldn't it be fun if we really inverted this stereotype and had a character who was just a nightmare. He was doing everything wrong. He was giving you the wrong information. He was really not the kind of instructor figure that you would want. And yeah, I like to think that through that approach, that we actually created quite a memorable character. So that is definitely one tool in our arsenal that we like to come back to. And as I say, it really is just to invert stereotypes and keep things original, and explore characters in a different way. You know.
There are a lot of points about international humanitarian law and the realities of war in Arma 3, especially in the DLC like Laws of War and Art of War. Why were these developed, and what were the motivations behind these DLCs, and how do you think they relate to the overall vision of the game?
I think as video game developers, we all share this moral responsibility to deconstruct the commercialized and sanitized depictions of modern conflict. The tagline for Arma 3 is "This is war," and well, international humanitarian law is a part of war, and it's something that we felt we were compelled to cover. You cannot approach this multifaceted, complex, and really truly horrible human phenomenon without tackling things like that. So that was one part of the decision. The other angle was actually something really quite practical, is that we wanted to make a meaningful difference in the world. And we did that with the charity angle, and working in collaboration with the International Committee of the Red Cross. So addressing things like the Geneva Conventions, the laws of armed conflict, we felt that they were quite important and could give the Arma franchise sort of a didactic edge. It could sort of be more educational. And we could share this really interesting information with the community, and also raise awareness, not just about the legal aspects, but also about things like landmines. I mean, really, when we were doing the research, it's just horrific. And all of us on the development team, I think we became quite passionate about addressing that particular issue. There's also, in terms of gameplay, international humanitarian law actually afforded us some really interesting opportunities to explore, whether it's positively identifying targets, whether it's protecting cultural heritage, or as I say, demining. These were all things that were actually, for entertainment purposes, quite fun to do. So there's a lot of things going on there.
They fit super well because with Arma we've always tried to portray the war also with those ends and nooks and crannies which are usually omitted. So for me, adding IHL inspired rules, or this whole topic, was to make Arma sandbox more complete, to complement it with something interesting, with something challenging. So it definitely has its place. Instead of just killing everyone, you have to observe some other rules, plan differently, adhere to something which feels more authentic in the end. I still believe this is a very important part of Arma Sandbox, and we intend to expand on it in the future. Like we've been doing it in Arma Reforger with communication and logistics. Howling logistics in the military. Well, it sounds like counterintuitive. Like for many people, it's actually more fun to be part of the big thing and interact and see that it's not just the combat which influences the victory. And loss of armed conflict is it's no different. For us, it's not a limitation. For us, it's an opportunity.
There are quite a few Easter eggs hidden within Arma 3. Are there any particular that you think have an interesting story?
There's one with super interesting story. Like I'll set off that alternate reality game we used to build up people's interest in Arma 3 setting and present a bit of it. It was a really fun thing to do in 2011, 12. But yeah, on Livonia, there's an Easter egg which has still not been discovered by the community, so I wonder when someone would figure it out. Otherwise, in many cases, I don't even know about those Easter eggs. I just searched for some on community sites, and it's apparent that with the sheer amount of content in the game, there's always someone doing some shenanigans without other people knowing. There are some more obvious things which always originate in someone's need to momentarily unwind and put something personal in there. Someone making a statue with the face of his girlfriend, or some funny inscriptions in the cockpits. Yeah, but all this was eventually discovered. But there's still one big thing we did in Livonia, which people still have to find. So good luck.
Yeah, actually, yeah. There's a few. Again, to take Arma Free Contact as an example, I'm not sure how many out there, how many of you out there have seen it, but there's the summoning of Captain Miller when you're using the Spectrum device. If you get the code right, he appears as some crazy apparition. That was quite fun. One of my colleagues, Hedrick, a designer, he managed to implement that, even though he had a lot of other tasks to focus on. He worked late, and I said, no, come on, we've got a million other things to do. But he was adamant, and he got it in there in his own time. I said, okay, well, credit to you. So that was nice to see. One of my favourite Easter eggs as well would be the rugged chair asset that appeared at the very top of the burn pit in the second mission of the Contact campaign. And I say that because that little asset, that little chair, was my APR project, which is an annual performance review. And I was so busy working on Contact that I really didn't have time to complete it, and it became this office joke. It's like, Scott, how's the chair coming on? I was like, yeah, I'll do it next week. I'll do it next week. And finally, I did it, and everyone was like, yay, well done. We're gonna put it at the top of the burn pit. So I was like, you guys. But yeah, no, it made it in, and I'm very proud of that chair.
Arma has built itself quite a universe that even the community has jumped into expanding through mods, Make Arma Not War competition, and even our Creator DLC program. Can you briefly tell us your thoughts on the community-contributed lore?
It was really amazing to see how creative people got from the very beginning, even before the release of the game, when only parts of setting was known. I remember seeing a world map of Armaverse in 2035, and there was lots of great thoughts, ideas, and big effort put into it. Then then there are some really great contributions to Make Arma Not War. Some of them really tried to fit in, and it's always nice to see people following the setting you've co-invented. Of course, there are sometimes very surprising additions, but generally speaking, I'm very fond of seeing all those semi-fictional, fictional factions, remixes of our older ideas, like Russian military in 2035. That's really great, and especially after some lifespan of the game, to put like this, the community content, if you play Arma 3 now, is a very important part of the whole product, of the whole thing. So and the fact that people are able to come up with, for example, their own island, like Icebreaker, the island's own factions, following how we do things, and people are having fun with it online. That's simply perfect.
I will say this, that the lore that develops in community projects has this habit of becoming canon. We do listen and we do watch what you're all up to. And as I say, this community lore building is subject very dear to my heart. I actually sort of began there really with a community project that I did, Resist, that was entered into the Make Arma Not War contest, and I really get that. I really get that sort of that passion for contributing to a pre-existing narrative. So it's really lovely to see, and there's this. I mean, honestly, I think it's like a bit of a symbiotic relationship between the community and the developers. There's a lot of ideas going back and forth, and I, for one, love to hear from members of the community when they get in touch and say, "Oh, Scott, what are your feelings about this?" I was like, "Well, okay," and then there's this, there's a bit of dialogue, a bit of a crossover, and it's really good because I don't really feel like Arma 3's narrative ever really belonged to anyone. It was something that evolved between a lot of people. So it was fun. So all I can say is that community lore, it's great. I want to see more of it. It's really exciting and hugely inspirational. It's really, really good to see.
What are the most notable experiences or aspects of working on Arma 3 storytelling that you enjoyed?
I'm super proud that people were actually embracing what we created, that people got it and they accepted our vision of the near future. And as we just discussed, the community kept expanding on the theme and kept contributing to Arma in an unusual setting. When I look back, there were highs and lows. Obviously, there were some great moments, usually connected with the corporation, with some great people. I actually enjoyed inventing the whole near future thing. I've mentioned all the cyberpunk books influence. Aesthetics, where me and Marek were discussing the movies, like his favorite Brothers, the Danish movie Brødre, trying to incorporate it all into a plausible mix which resonated with me and felt like, yeah, this is the kind of story I would want to tell. In the beginning, it was very raw power, and it was truly enjoyable, and also, now, looking back, for example, at the creator DLCs contributing to our content or to everything we've achieved as the team, including everyone who has left in the meantime, it's making me proud, definitely.
I would say definitely the collaboration with members of both the team and the community. I have many fond memories of working with the design team in Czech Republic. Guys, you know who you are. And the same can be said with the team in Amsterdam, working on the Laws of War, the Remnants of War campaign. It was just a blast. It really was. So for me, the most memorable aspect of the storytelling is having that opportunity to work with some really talented people and some great minds. So yeah, and I've learned a lot on the way too.
Any parting last words you want to express to the community?
Well, I would like to thank to everyone for playing the game, to contribute to it in their own way, and of course I would like to thank all my colleagues, past and present, for their contributions, because without them, there would be no Arma 3. And I'm particularly happy that the times when I was distant from the project, there were still people safeguarding the vision and expanding it. So the project grew, and it grew well and matured accordingly. And well, I sincerely hope that the greatest things in Arma are still yet to come. So thank you and see you.
Yeah, a massive, massive thank you. Armor Free wouldn't be what it is today without you. It's as simple as that. You know, your continued support, your creativity. Yeah, I hope that you are as proud of it as I am.